All right, welcome to another edition of your goddamn favorite political podcast, The Curse of Politics. And it is good to have all of you accursed back with us. Us, as always, is me and the bonfire of the profanities, Jenni Byrne and Scott Reid. We've got so much show on the show today. We'll talk about Erin O'Toole's breakaway caucus of the unvaccinated, the leadership vacuum that preceded it, and he's just announced his shadow cabinet. Lots of news about the Conservatives today. In fact, our cursed clipping this week is Campbell Clark's piece on O'Toole being treated by his own party. More on the inflation economy. Lots going on. We'll try to solve what the politics of inflation are right now and how the government's handling that, can handle that. Try to solve the case of the missing mandate letters. Where are they and why the holdup? And of course, the curse of politics doesn't end without Gordon Pinson teeing up our Hey Yous. Scott, Jenni, it's great to see you again this week. How are you?
Hi, great.
Just great.
Yeah?
Fantastic.
And in your...
You both say that. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, David.
I was going to say you both say that in a way I don't believe it.
Well, I'm never great, as you know. I'm always dissatisfied.
I'm always great.
Jenni's general disposition is, you know what, things are good. And my general disposition is things are about to get really bad.
Well, in terms of cursing, David, I was going to say my sister got me this coffee mug and it says, I do not spew profanities. I enunciate them clearly like a lady.
That is excellent. That is excellent. Okay, speaking of profanities, do you guys want to talk about politics or hockey?
I'd rather talk about politics, and that says something.
I don't think either one of those subjects is terribly interesting to me, frankly.
What do you want to talk about?
Comic books, comic book movies. I went to see The Eternals. I was gravely disappointed. I think MCU might have jumped the shark, but I'm guessing that's a different podcast.
But yes,
it could be. It could be a spinoff. Yeah. The Curse of Marvel.
That's right.
Okay. So let's talk politics. The Liberals finally had a caucus meeting yesterday. If there was any kind of showdown or confrontation, everybody's pretty tight-lipped about it. I have no idea what went on in that caucus meeting other than that they elected a caucus chair and they turned down the Reform Act, unsurprisingly. Anybody got any tidbits? What happened in there?
Oh, you're asking that's Scott. You go right ahead.
I have no tid or bits, but I'll tell you what I think. What I think is when the prime minister was asked, how come you haven't had a caucus and all that stuff? Basically, his answer was, well, caucus isn't a fucking problem for me, man. And I think that there's zero evidence he's wrong. Like, caucus is clearly not a problem for him. I don't know if somebody went to the mic and said I'm dissatisfied about this or that or whatever. I would almost be shocked if that did happen. It would be my honest to God impression. I just don't think that's the kind of caucus these guys have. And as far as I could tell, the PM opened up the doors, gave a speech, caucus cheered. So caucus was just basically a backdrop for the prime minister to, grab O'Toole by what's left of his hair and punch him in the face 3 or 4 times, which he did relatively effectively. I'm sorry, that hair thing was cheap. I take it back. Just because my hair is perfect, like Tom Cruise in Color of Money, Vince, that doesn't mean I should make fun of a baldly challenged fellow.
When I talk to liberal backbenchers, they sound to me like they think they're involved in a different enterprise than the government. It's the weirdest conception of their role. Like it is, it's as if Trudeau and Telford and Freeland are off running the government, and these people know what their jobs are. Their jobs are to show up at their parliamentary rounds, do what they're supposed to do in Parliament, manage their constituency, campaign all the time, and not make trouble. And everybody seems pretty comfortable with that job description.
You talk about that like it's a bad thing. I would have traded my left nut for that.
It's a great thing if you're the executive branch, but I find it unusual. I find it unusual that they think they have so little so little say and so little stake in what the decision makers are doing.
Yeah, I find it bizarre too, David, and I think that it under Harper, I think, was pretty much the same as what it was under you guys. Caucus was at a very important dynamic. They were involved in government decisions. We had caucus advisory groups that, of course, didn't get cabinet documents or information, but at least ideas were run through cabinet in terms of how this could affect locally and their constituents, and to bounce ideas off of. So it is a much different structure than what I think governments that preceded them are. I also think it works well for Trudeau. I'm not sure it works well for the Liberal Party generally. I think that this is culturally, it's a change. I think it's culturally on the political party side. I think Trudeau has obviously elevated their game big time in the last in the last 6 years that he's been prime minister. I don't think that probably the structure that they have government wise is going to do them any favors in a post Trudeau era.
Well, I think it's a product of almost all of the MPs arriving with Trudeau as leader, and almost none of them predate him. And so they don't know any reality before him, and they think they owe their jobs to him in entirety. And in 2015, they certainly did. And, the party did. So you can't forget that. But it is now 2021.
I think that's right. I mean, I think we've said this before, but it's all Michael Ignatius' fault. He burned the party, who's out with a splendiferous new book, as we see, on consolation. I read the 99,000-word excerpt in the or essay about his book. He wrote an essay about his book rather than just excerpted in the Globe Mail this weekend. It was hard slogging, drenched in word sauce. But he burned the party to the ground. And it took Trudeau and his brand and his energy and his appeal to rebuild the party. But once it was rebuilt around Trudeau. And as you say, all those MPs come to town. They've got no frame of reference. They've not been in caucus before. They've not been in cabinet before. And they said, look, this is a team effort. This is a shared enterprise. Our fortunes are attached to his fortunes, and off they went. And they didn't have this kind of 20 years history of, the Chrétien guys try to hunt down the Turner guys, and the Turner guys become Martin guys, and the Martin guys. They didn't have any of that kind of stuff. And there's not even this sort of local MP who goes like the Roger Galloways who go, and I'm just going to piss in everybody's soup because I think it's fun and I'm not getting into cabinet, and that's the way it works. Every party had Roger Galloways, when every party had 4 Roger Galloways for 60 years. And, they've just created a different culture. So to Jenni's point, what happens when Trudeau leaves? How does the institution post Trudeau look and sound? And it'll be interesting. But it's not a problem for Trudeau because it ain't a problem.
No, and in fact, I think the reason why they took so long to get to a caucus meeting was because of all the pressures that they faced, getting cabinet together, getting staffing together, which I understand to be a big job right now. Of all the pressures that they faced as a government, even vacation, caucus was the least pressure that they faced.
Yeah, but can you not walk and chew gum at the same time? Can you not can you not work behind the scenes to appoint a cabinet and have a caucus meeting as well?
You'd think you could, Jenni. You would think you could, yeah. I'm sure you've heard the expression game the system. But have you ever tried to do it? Game the system? In a situation where the stakes were so high, hundreds of thousands of people would lose quality of life, all because you wanted to personally profiteer to the tune of millions of dollars? No, I'm thinking you haven't done that. But it's happening right now in rural communities all across Canada, where a few billionaire-controlled regional cable companies are not using government spectrum subsidies to do what they're supposed to do, provide high-speed digital connectivity to the good people who live in those communities. Nope, their game is to use social policy as an investment tool. Take the subsidies and just sit on them. Wait. Provide no service. Build no cell towers or other infrastructure to help rural communities connect. And eventually, resell the spectrum on the secondary market for millions of dollars in profit. I'm sad to say this is not a one-time loophole, Herle-Burleites. It's happening over and over again. Rinse and repeat. And the people who live in our rural communities are the ones getting rinsed. As a technology leader with a social purpose, this is not how our presenting sponsor, TELUS, does business. TELUS believes that if you say you're going to work with government and take their spectrum subsidies for rural Canada, then you have an obligation, a responsibility to provide that service to rural Canada. As I said before, the stakes are high. These places need high-speed connectivity to deliver proper health care and education, so people can farm their land with the latest technology and do business beyond their borders. Otherwise, they leave. Rural, remote, and Indigenous communities wither and die. Here's a starting point. Right now, with infrastructure that's already in place, TELUS could boost service to over 250,000 households in Alberta and BC if spectrum that was being held for profit by others was simply unlocked. Go to telus.com/connectingcanada to learn more. All right. Let's go to clippings. Campbell Clark made me laugh like hell. On November the 5th in the Globe and Mail. I'll just read the beginning and the end. Aaron O'Toole is stuck up a tree and he can't get down. His own party is at the bottom, waiting, and he doesn't know what to do. His voters are waiting. His leadership race supporters are there too, and well, that's a bit awkward. He doesn't dare go anywhere people might ask questions about politics or government or issues of the day, because one of those questions might be about vaccines and whether his MPs are vaccinated. So Mr. O'Toole doesn't go out into the public eye much. He doesn't say much. What to do? Mr. O'Toole doesn't seem to know. He is treed, but he can't stay up there forever. Well, he did come down from the tree yesterday, and it didn't go very well, did it?
Well, it didn't go well because he came out to talk about a week-old news story. He came out to talk about apparently the risky coalition with the NDP. It was reminiscent of 2008 messaging of the risky coalition with the NDP and the Bloc Québécois, but it's a much different circumstance. We talked about last week or the week before, the Liberals do not need the NDP to officially prop them up. The only thing the Liberals seemingly care about in terms of, I think in terms of having a coalition would be to try to keep some certain issues out of committees regarding things like and what have you. And as we discussed, that's not in the interest of the NDP. Singh could not sell that proposition to his caucus, even if he tried. And in fact, they both came out yesterday and said, yeah, this thing isn't happening. So when you come out to talk about a stale news story, of course, all of the questions are going to end up being about the issue the media want to talk about. He would have been better if he had been out for the last 2.5 weeks talking about financial issues that we have addressed on the pod, and I know we're going to talk about more today, that actually are newsy and actually affect Canadians. So it was kind of bizarre that he decided to go out yesterday, and it was equally bizarre that he chose to go out on the issue that he did.
Yeah. Look, if you want people to eat roast beef, don't set it next to lobster. He came out with this story about the NDP Liberal coalition, maybe a real thing, maybe a fiction, who knows what it is, but it wasn't nearly as interesting as asking about his own internal caucus problems. And look, there's one very simple rule when you're a leader. You can't look weak. You just can't. And when you do look weak, it's gruesome. And he looked weak for a bunch of reasons. One, he looks weak because he is in a weak position, right? The caucus has him by the balls. This stupid, crazy, goddamn Reform Act thing leaves him in a situation where effectively caucus can oust him, or at least initiate the process of ousting him, but he can't even sit caucus members outside of caucus. He's left to do what he did this morning, decide that he won't pick certain people to be shadow cabinet ministers. Well, whippy. All that's going to do is give people an opportunity to further bash him, but he can't put them in. He can't sit them out. It doesn't matter. It's feckless. It's a feckless tool. So he looks weak. He is weak. I suspect he picked up the newspaper on the weekend and slammed it down on the table and called his staff and said, "Goddamn Campbell Clark can't tell me that I'm up a tree. I'm going to get down the tree and hold a press conference. We're going to go after this Liberal NDP coalition." And his staff said, "Right on, sir. You bet. We're going to give him a dose." And then he got a dose, all right. He got a dose, right, of his own caucus. And when he goes out, I think he's holding a news conference today. He's going to get another dose of it. He's just, there's no way around it. He's nutless. And when you're nutless,
what could he do?
It's hard to talk.
But what could he do in this circumstance? People keep calling on him to show leadership. What would leadership look like in this circumstance? I mean, he doesn't have any control or authority.
Put forward a motion in caucus saying that he wants to see these people removed. And then, of course, the risk is that won't pass. And then he looks even more neutered. I don't know. I don't know how he remedies that situation.
But this is less about vaccines than it is the leadership vacuum that's happening right now within the Conservative caucus and the Conservative Party. This just happens to be the issue that is driving it to the forefront. I'm not sure what he does right now, because everything he has done up to this point has not made sense to me in terms of wanting to keep his job. Like I would have, from election night onwards, I would have been calling up all the caucus members, especially the ones that you internally know are most critical and publicly know are critical, and eat shit. Like, basically call them, say, this is going to change. I'm going to listen to you. Like, that would have been my 2 weeks after the election. I would have started it like at midnight, the night of when it became evident what the results of the election were going to be. And I also would be then acting like a leader of the opposition. As I said, there have been major political stories out in terms of the economy for the last 3 weeks, longer, but for the 3 weeks, from inflation to COP, there have been actually meat and potato type issues that people care about. And he has been just silent on it. Up until yesterday, the only thing the party was commenting on was the flag at half-mast and the French skills of the Air Canada CEO. So the stuff he should be doing is actually acting like the leader of the opposition, but I'm not sure whether he can do that now. And I don't know if he's capable of doing it. Like, it's been almost 2 months since the election.
This Reform Act takes away the hammer. And when you're already in a weakened position and you don't have a hammer, even if you're afraid to swing it, then you really do have nothing. And now he's stuck. And I would add one thing. I know, Jenni, you say it's not about vaccines. It may not be, it may be the vaccine issue that's afflicting this sort of mini caucus, which, by the way, is one of the worst possible phrases to describe yourself. Mini caucus. As a male, I'm telling you right now, you won't be seeing me with a shirt that says mini caucus, mini caucus member. I won't have that. But it's a problem. It's a problem for the Conservative Party writ large. It is a big problem because
how so, Scott?
Well, I'll tell you. It's a big goddamn problem. You've got Alberta. You've got Saskatchewan. You've got cases rising in Ontario. You've got misinformation being bandied about in a genuinely irresponsible fashion by Conservative MPs, and the overall brand damage is significant. It projects, in the absence of anything else, and O'Toole can't project anything else because he's so neutered, it projects real questions in the minds of Canadians as to whether or not they're in the swim of the major consensus. 75 to 90% of people are like, you know what, I'm not going to question the virtue of vaccines. But you hear this from Conservatives. It may be a small minority of them, but they're awful loud. They might be 15, they might be 30 in caucus. It's a problem. And for the Conservatives, you got to get this issue off the table. Because if this is what people hear you talking about and arguing about, the conclusion that a lot of people are going to come to is these guys are not lined up on these fundamental issues with me. And that is a problem. And it's a damaging problem for the brand overall.
Well, and I'd also be asking the Liberals, because, of course, we know with the public service mandate to have vaccines, there is a lot of caveats in that. It's actually looking more and more like the feds are going to end up going to either vaccinated or a rapid testing model, because we know that certain front-facing public service positions are with CRA, like auditors and people that work in Veterans Affairs offices, they are not mandated.
All that whataboutism gets you fucking nowhere. Okay, you got a problem. The Conservative Party has a problem. When people generally think that Trudeau is in favor of vaccines, in favor of mandatory vaccination, and yeah, there's going to be all kinds of things that you can punch in, little places you can hit on, but fundamentally that's what they think. And fundamentally they don't know what to think of where the Conservative Party stands on this fundamental issue.
But Scott, the reason, it's because Aaron has been fuzzy, but the reason that Trudeau gets away with hypocrisy like mandatory vaccinations in the public service is because nobody is holding him to account on it.
Okay.
Well, they can't, as long as their own position is too weak. But I wanted to. If you are the opposition leader, is the shittiest job in politics, and if you are the opposition leader going into an election, if you've been elected and you're going into an election, it's still a shitty job, but at least you've got the hammer of an upcoming election and you haven't had a chance yet. And so you've got a little bit of authority that accrues to you that way. I'm telling you, if I was a politician that was defeated in an election, I would resign that day, because the days and weeks after you lose, you don't get to run again anyway, and you just subject yourself to a bleeding for as long as you're prepared to take it.
Well, it depends on the
until you finally leave.
But David, that's not blanket. It depends on, like, if you lose an election, but you've actually made significant gains, like the 2004 election, it would have been ridiculous for Stephen Harper to step down. So I think it's a case-by-case basis. We talked about why Aaron is not Stephen Harper and why these circumstances are different. But I think that just saying someone has lost is not is a reason to step down. I think there is a lot of factors to look at it. And we've already belabored the factors in terms of where Aaron is sitting. It's the manner of how he won the leadership, a manner of how he campaigned, and to a large degree, the month and a half of the last month and a half after the election.
You know,
Right.
that
I hear that.
Yeah, I do too. But it also leads me to, I don't know if we've talked about this before, but I mean, there's another thing about 2004 that's different than this circumstance. And it's not just the leader, over which there are many differences, but it's also the party and the temperature of the party. It doesn't feel to me like, and this is my impression, so I'll transparently, and you can swap me on this one, Jenni, big time, because it's just my impression. But my impression is this caucus is insufficiently afraid of losing. They don't really care if they lose. Whereas in 2004, Harper was like, you know what? I'm sick and fucking tired of losing to these guys. I don't want to lose anymore. So we're going to have to, do some things here. We're going to have to put some water in our wine. We're going to have to figure out how to navigate certain issues in order to secure victory. And I don't know that speech will rally this particular set of troops. It feels to me like the Maryland Gladiators and the Lesland don't give a fuck. It's like, if I win, I don't care. And, I'm not seized with the fear of losing.
You're completely wrong about that.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, you're completely wrong about that. People want to win. They also don't want to be liberals. That's part of they want to win, but they've now looked at the strategy that Aaron had. People weren't comfortable with it going in, and they realized that it isn't winning. Us campaigning like you guys is not. Conservatives don't win when they try to out-liberal the liberals. And so that's the problem that Aaron has. There is no acknowledgement seemingly from him or his people that they made fundamental mistakes in terms of policy during the last election.
Okay, but just let me take one more run at this. I grant you all that. But Harper said after 2004, hey, Randy White, if you're going to continue to be in the caucus, you got to kind of shut the fuck up, okay? Because we need to focus on securing victory. Did he say that, Scott? Were you there? Well, I wasn't there, but I noticed that Randy White shut the fuck up. And so I'm wondering, can anybody in the current circumstances, particularly O'Toole, say that to some of these folks? And are you certain that they care more about a collective win than standing for what they believe is their principles? I'm going to fight on this issue. I'm going to fight for my right to spread misinformation. I just think that's the right thing to do, and I don't care what the leader of the party says.
But if they believe it, Scott, it's likely. If they believe it, it's likely that they also think it's good politics. So they're wrong about that, but they may also think they're on the right side of the political issue.
Well, that's what happens in opposition, right? When MPs mistake the collective political challenge for their own personal political experience. Like what works in my riding must be what works nationally, and that doesn't always. Yeah, but
there are all factions within caucus. Like you guys use the social conservative rural caucus to help out John Chrétien in the Liberal Party. That was your base. That the rural MPs from Ontario who were mostly socially conservative, right? So, there are always.
I think you're overlooking the disaffected and disenfranchised Italian members of Parliament who felt that they would make better.
That's exactly right. There you go.
So there's always factions in caucus. It doesn't mean that they're the vast majority, but there are always factions in caucus. So I think that like to kind of say this is an anomaly or what have you, there's always different dynamics. My point is that this is less about vaccines internally than what it is about Aaron's leadership generally. He is not respected by caucus. And when you have no respect of caucus, this is the kind of stuff that happens.
Okay.
If I was him, I'd be inclined to force a showdown right fucking now. Let's bring the leadership review vote up. Let's just do this right now. Am I going to lead the party into the next election, or am I going to get hemorrhaged to death over the next 2 years? Let's just have it right now.
That's where this ends up, right? I mean, that's what happened to Clark. Eventually, he had to say, "I'm scared of my position. I know that my position is weak, but if I don't call the question, I just lay here on the floor and bleed out."
But I think that that's exactly what Aaron is scared of. There's a reason why he's hardly been out, and he's essentially been paralyzed since the election. So it's not like he's going to have the stones.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, it's not like he's going to have the stones to stand up and say, "Okay, fuckers, vote for me. Let's do the Reform Act. Vote for me," because he's afraid of the results. So, like, I don't see what. Like, I know
if the results are bad, he should take it and go. I mean, fuck it. What are you going to do for the next 2 years? Bleed. It's terrible.
I don't disagree with you, but I don't disagree with you, David. I would do the same thing, but I don't think there's been zero evidence to indicate that Aaron would and his team would actually do that.
Right. Well, if you don't do that, if you don't take David's advice and do that, as unappealing as that might be when you're in Aaron O'Toole's position, then you, Aaron O'Toole, and your team around you have to at least imagine that there is a route forward as an alternative that it permits you to secure the leadership. So what is that, right? And I guess where David's coming from is I recognize how unappealing that option is, but I don't see that this trying to bob and weave around stuff, right? I'm going to call out Marilyn Gladu, but I'm not going to kick her out because I can't kick her out because the Reform Act has an elastic tied around my nuts. Like, it's just, I don't know. I think ultimately you have to turn that Reform Act into a sword as opposed to a shield, because right now it's
well, by the time 2023 comes along, you're going to lose, and you'll deserve to lose because you'll have been horribly ineffective for 2 years. Your reputation will be in the gutter. You shouldn't be the leader anymore by the time that's finished. That process is finished with. So
it's a gruesome spot.
The Reform Act is ridiculous, but as we've said before, regardless of the Reform Act, once you have lost caucus in great numbers, it doesn't matter. You cannot and will not stay on as leader.
Yeah.
Right. So here's a phrase you probably never thought you'd hear: battery-powered locomotive. And I'm not talking about model trains. Yep, a 200-ton steel behemoth capable of several thousand horsepower, hauling an entire train, but running on batteries. A lot of batteries. Our sponsor, CN, just commissioned one. It's going to look like a regular locomotive, and it'll be just as powerful, but without direct greenhouse gas emissions, air contaminants, and engine noise. When the first specimen arrives, it'll be used to move rail cars around the train yard, switching them between tracks, that sort of thing. Eventually, the plan is to pair it with regular locomotives. You've probably seen trains being pulled by 2 locomotives. The idea is that the battery-powered locomotive would be used to help power a train up a hill. Just an example. These new locomotives will not be hybrids. They will be entirely electric-powered. And yes, they'll be plugged in for charging, sort of. They'll likely have a power transfer platform on the roof, which will be used to connect the locomotive to the grid. Like e-cars, they'll charge in a few hours. But where a Tesla, say, attaches to a 150 kilowatt supercharger, the new CN locomotives will slurp from a 1,000 kilowatt connection. We're talking a lot of juice. Will they be the future? CN doesn't know yet, and neither does anyone else. But the railway does know it's committed to reducing greenhouse gas emission intensity by over 40% within the next 9 years. Catenary power, powering the locomotive by electrified tracks or a separate line, is also under consideration. So is hydrogen. So is a combination of battery, catenary, and hydrogen. In any case, one way or the other, CN intends to eventually stop burning fossil fuel in its fleet. The electric delivery trucks the railway ordered last year are further proof. One CN train already does the work of hundreds of tractor trailers, with a lot less emissions, and the railway will get much greener. That's a promise. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the economy and messaging around the economy. We've talked about this in the past, and we had another great example of it this week, where the Bank of Canada is trying to explain their situation and trying to explain their perspective on the economy.
They're trying to issue They're trying to issue managed statements that they made just 3 months ago. Let's be honest, what they're trying to do.
Well, there's something to that. There's something to that for sure. And what the governor said this week, which sounded at variance with what had been said before, was that inflation, while not permanent, was going to be around for a while. We were going to be seeing relatively high inflation numbers for a while, although he claimed it was transitory, but without putting a time frame on it. Again, we hear nothing.
But transitory, it means it's short-lived.
Normally, well, or
no,
impermanent.
That's the definition. But that's the definition. Like, transitory means it's short-lived, David. I could say that my sweater is green instead of purple, but it doesn't make it fucking green.
Right. So, again, nothing from the government on this subject, and so my feeling is that this is a lot of field of play that is being left open by the government, and the Conservatives are making some noise about it. Do you think they're making some headway? Do you think the government's sleepwalking into something here?
I'm not sure if they're sleepwalking into it. I listen. I think that you've had people like Pierre and Poilievre out speaking about basically inflation for the last year. But I don't know if the government is sleepwalking into anything. I think they just might not care, which is very detrimental. I would, if I were sitting around that cabinet, I would be absolutely terrified about what it's looking like in terms of the economy, in terms of inflation. Even though Tiff Macklin said in July inflation was never going to be a problem, a month later it was. And now indicating that it won't be 2023 that there could be an interest rate hike. It could be in the second or third quarter of 2022, which is, essentially 6 months away. So I'd be very worried about that. But instead they, spent all of last week flailing about COP, making promises that are never going to come to fruition.
Well, I had Frances Donald, an economist, on the Herle last week. She was making the point to me that there's a distinction between inflation and the cost of living, and that the cost of living is indeed a problem for ordinary people, but it's unrelated to the tools of the Bank of Canada. It's mostly related to energy shortages globally and to supply chain issues globally. She did not think that an interest rate increase was the right response to that. But it does sort of shift the onus. If she's correct, it shifts the onus from the Bank of Canada in terms of what are you going to do about inflation to the government of Canada to say, what are you going to do about the cost of living? Which is a different matter. And don't you think the government should be looking active right now on trying to solve supply chain issues, on trying to use whatever tools they have to look like they're trying to address this program? They look entirely passive to me about it.
Well, they're not passive in terms of energy shortages. That's all they've talked about for the last week and a half in terms of coming out of COP. But I don't think that probably that's what she had in mind when she talked about it.
I think Frances Donald is right. I do think there's a distinction between inflation and cost of living. And in a strange way, I think that the cost of living is a better attack for the Conservatives than inflation. I'll come back to Conservatives. My fundamental view is I think there's political risk on both sides of this issue, meaning that both the Liberals and the Conservatives have a risk of getting this thing wrong and not getting not getting full political value out of the challenge that's ahead of them. I think the obvious challenge for the government, and it's a really pronounced challenge, is that they look as though it's not their job. I mean, any of these arguments, even the argument if you go down Francis Donald's path, right, that she can make that argument. The government cannot afford to make that argument. The government cannot afford to make the argument that it's not my fault and it's therefore not my problem to fix. As you say, David, they ought to be doing things that say the fundamental issues here may only last for 24 months. Maybe they last less, maybe they last more. I don't know. But we as a government are going to put our shoulders to the wheel in terms of trying to remedy these supply chain problems, trying to make certain that people get through this period without being too badly hurt, right? Trying to do everything we can. The risk for the government is that it conveys a signal of not my job, and therefore not, since it's not my fault, it's not my job. And sometimes in government, you have to fix things that aren't your fault. That's just the fucking political gravity of the situation. And I think we're in one of those situations. For the Conservatives, I think there's a real risk that, Tiff Macklem might be right. And if that's the case, you got to be careful about how hard you go on this and not I think you should go hard on it. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. I think you should be going hard on this set of issues. I just think you got to be careful about predicting too heavily. You go on the cost of living saying, look, cost of living has gone up. It's going to continue to go up. It isn't necessarily just about inflation. It's about a whole suite of policies that the government has gotten wrong. Make that broader argument. But if you bet on inflation writ large, then what are you an advocate for? Higher interest rates? Is that good for people? No, it's not. So I think, they got to be careful not to overreach the Conservatives.
Stop printing money. That's ultimately what it has.
That's actually a bullshit argument. So again, you got to be careful. Is that bullshit argument work for you?
How is it a bullshit argument?
Because they're not actually printing money and they're actually tapering off the quantitative easing.
That's actually what they've done for the last year and a half.
No, it's not actually. It's not what they've done.
It's actually what they were doing.
Quantitative easing is being discontinued. So, I mean, the real issue for the Conservatives, if you tell people things that aren't true, then you're going to get checked on that eventually. But if you say to people things that they are concerned about and say there's a better approach that the government ought to pursue, then that resonates. And then the final thing, and this is always a problem for any opposition, is you can't look like you're cheering failure. And that is tricky. That's tricky business, right? So you can't sound like you've got to always be accompanying it with some sort of sense of what ought to be happening instead. And it can't just be, well, quit spending time on climate and start focusing on inflation. And you don't want to look like, aha, there's new inflation numbers and they're bad. See, we're right. Hooray for us.
I don't think anyone's saying that.
I think you're dangerously close to sounding like you're cheering failure.
I don't think anyone's saying that. I think that the sheer arrogance of this Liberal government, the fact that they haven't spoken about this, the seeming fact that they don't care. I do not think that the Conservatives are at a risk to be cheering on any kind of failure. And I know, Scott, you are enamored with the Bank of Canada. You are enamored with Tiff Macklem and the Bank of Canada. Every prediction that he has made over the last year and a half has turned out to be wrong. So
I'm not enamored with him, but Jenny, you got to allow for the possibility you might not be right. You might not be fucking right, okay? He might be right and you might be wrong. So why put all your chips on that side of the table?
Scott, I brought up that inflation was going to go up on the podcast last year at this time. Tiff Macklem said on July 31st, don't worry, we're not going to see inflation. And then
that's not what he said, to be fair. No, the Bank of Canada said there could be inflationary impacts, but they thought that they would be short-lived. Now they're saying that's not. They're updating their view for sure.
In July, he said inflation was not going to be an issue. And in August, it rose by 4.1%. So that is the history of the Bank of Canada.
I'm telling you, the rules of official opposition are such that you cannot run the risk that you sound like you're cheering failure. It's a delicate dance, and it doesn't matter if you're a liberal or a conservative, and it's been ever thus. So it's just throw me out the window and tell me I'm wrong. But I'm telling you, you got to be careful on tone when it comes to these issues.
Jenny sounds like Carolyn Wilkins' campaign manager.
Transitory, but not.
Hey, late breaking news. Yesterday, I believe it was yesterday, Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland sent a letter to Air Canada saying, A, make your CEO learn French right now or get rid of him and get somebody else. And second of all, make French a requirement for all senior executive positions within Air Canada. I'm super interested that she sent this letter. And that it came from her. I mean, I guess she's the shareholder, but it still seems odd to me that it came from her.
It helps build her profile in Quebec for an upcoming leadership race, whenever that is.
But this is the thing. It feels like a very political. It feels like an indication of how sensitive the Liberals are going to be to Quebec politics all the time. And so it feels like a liberal brand move in Quebec, but it also feels like a Freeland brand move in Quebec.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what it is.
It sure as heck does. And you can make an argument for, look, here's why it's a justifiable opinion. Here's why it's justified for the opinion to come from her. But I don't think it happened by mistake. I don't think that, she didn't say, you know what? I could send this letter, but let's put it to the languages minister. Let's have, the minister responsible for official languages. Let's put it there, or let's have the minister of transport do. No, I'm the shareholder. It's finance. I'm justified in sending it. I think I'll send it. I think I like the way that it plays. There's a whole chorus of people that like to speculate that she's the hands-on nominee. Power's going to transfer her at some point. I've always expressed my skepticism about that. But little tweaky events like this sure give some momentum to those who make that argument.
That guy should be fired because not because he doesn't speak French, but because he's dumb as a post. I don't get it. I lived in Montreal for 2.5 years in my youth, and I can vouch for his opinion that you can live in Montreal and not need to learn French because the Francophones there are very accommodating and they will largely speak English to you. And so you can do it. So I can understand how he lived there for all those years and never learned the language. But I can't understand how he lived there all those years and never understood the sensitivity around the fact that he hadn't learned the language. So the fact that he didn't think it was an issue, that he thought that those lines he offered up would actually work, shows such an appalling sense of the community that he lives in. He must live an incredibly restricted life on the West Island, hanging around with only Anglophones because, my God, he didn't understand that city at all, or that province at all.
Well,
Weird.
not all business people translate into good politicians or political actors. And frankly, his talking points were cut and paste from Mary Simon. Yes, I'm 63 years old and I'm going to try to learn French.
No, he said he wasn't really going to try. He said he was a lot more cavalier. But look, I've had this argument with people in different circumstances over the years, and people can complain about, it doesn't seem like it's fair or whatever. The fundamental perspective being shared, in addition to the personal perspective, like his personal perspective that you're talking about, David, is that the company says that it wants to position itself as we're just a company like any other. I'm sorry, you're not a company like any other. You were a crown corporation. Then there was the whole, Air Canada Public Participation Act. You had certain obligations that came out of, conditions that were agreed to as a part of the privatization. That may seem like a million years ago, but it's still there. And of course, the government bought in after what was a very tense, let's not forget, really tense and really long set of negotiations as to whether they would come in and do something to help the airlines. And then they come in and they purchase shares, which gives them a voice. And, you can sit around and go, well, we're just going to run our business like any other business, but you're not like any other business. I had these fucking arguments with the head of Hydro One when he came in, and he was like, the number one thing we need to send to markets is that we're not politicized and we're a company like any other. And I kept saying, you're not a company like any other. And if you don't recognize that, you're going to actually get crucified. He got crucified. $6 million man.
So who replaces him, Alain Vigneault or Michel Therrien?
Alain Vigneault.
Well, listen, as long as people are talking about this, it gives the Liberals a pass on issues that actually affect Canadians.
Yeah. Okay. It's time for our Hey Yous. Gordon, can you rally the troops for us?
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
All right. Who wants to go first with their Hey You?
Scott, I've gone first for the last 3 pods in a row. You get to go first this time.
That's because I'm a coward and I wait to hear what you say and then I figure out something on the fly. All right. Okay. My Hey You is to Mike Pearson. Mr.
Really?
Pearson. Yeah.
Yell loud.
I hope he's listening. Mr. Pearson, for decades, people have looked at your minority parliament and said, my God, it's the shining example of what we can be and what we can accomplish in a minority. We can have an activist agenda. We can change the country. We can build a legacy that will last for decades. See, put in public pensions and public health care and raise the flag, and and every prime minister who finds himself in a minority circumstance is tempted to think, well, maybe this is a blessing in disguise. Maybe this will be I can build this big activist legacy. If Prime Minister Trudeau is looking at this situation now and saying, you know what, I've taken 2 runs at getting a minority, but maybe now I'll do a deal. Maybe I'll do a real deal with the NDP, and we'll bring in not just childcare, but we're going to bring in pharmacare, and we're going to shake this thing up, and it's going to be my great Pearson-esque legacy. Well, then I say to you, Mr. Pearson, rise from the grave and whisper it in his ear. Be careful. Be careful, because if the price of some sort of pact with the NDP is that you're going to have not 1, but 2 shared cost national programs you're trying to run through the country at the same time with no hint whatsoever that there's a fiscal anchor, I just think you're asking for a ton of trouble, and I'd be really, really careful. So, Mr. Pearson, if you're up there, down there, around there, floating out there, please issue a warning.
Wow. Like a seance.
We haven't had a call across the divide before on a hey you.
Well,
Jenny, you got a living person?
Yeah, well, my hey you is kind of, it's either to conservatives or it's to people like your buddy Mark Carney in terms of being honest about what was coming out of COP. So they announced a $130 billion fund to convert the world to green energy.
Trillion.
Sorry,
with a T.
$1
Trillion.
30 trillion. So out of Paris, they had a $100 billion fund, which they never spent. $130 trillion is bigger than the entire world's GDP. It's 6 times the total number of US dollars in existence. It is 3 times the combined market value of every publicly listed stock.
It's going to change everything. It's enormous.
In the US. It will never happen. And so I implore on people like Mark Carney to be honest that this is actually a bullshit announcement and it's never going to happen. And I call on conservatives to actually call bullshit on the fact that this is never going to happen.
Mark, maybe you could respond on Twitter. I don't know. It feels wrong to let that go unrebutted, but we don't rebut hey yous. My hey you goes out to the Liberals. And that is, on this whole cost of living thing, have a plan this winter for fuel prices. Have a political strategy for fuel prices, especially natural gas prices. Do not be cavalier about this. Do not for a moment think that the daily polls that come out showing that Canadians support everything that was done at COP in overwhelming numbers, support a cap on oil and gas production overwhelmingly. Don't be confused by any of that into thinking that they support higher fuel prices. They don't. And as somebody with all the scars to prove it, I can tell you that this can kill a government. And so natural gas prices in particular, have a plan for that, because it won't be a climate change message that gets you through that issue.
That was a nice transition from mine.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
T.
And I want to thank
T
our
as in transition.
As in transition. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail. And I want to tell everybody that we are doing a live event for the Canadian Club at the Pilot Bar in Toronto. Our old friends, the Pilot, are hosting us. Our old friends, the Canadian Club, are putting it on. And November 22nd, limited number of tickets, very limited number of tickets. And be there if you can. Love to see you. Everybody, Scott, Jenny, take care. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, everybody out there.